From wherever you are around the world, welcome and thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be exploring America Interventionism. What is it, and is it good for us? We're going to find out. We have Dr. Peter Kuznick. He wrote this wonderful book, The Untold History of the United States, which is one of many of his books, and we'll get to those a little bit later. Dr. Kuznick is professor of history and director of the award-winning Nuclear Studies Institute at American University, and is currently serving his fourth term as distinguished lecturer with the Organization of American Historians. Let's welcome Dr. Kuznick to the circle. Welcome, Dr. Kuznick.
Glad to be here.
So this is a really interesting concept, the American Interventionism. There's a huge debate. Presidential elections are months away. But before we get into all that, I wanted to find out what made you write the book, The Untold History of the United States, and what's it about?
Well, the book came about. Oliver Stone made me an offer I couldn't refuse. Back in 2007, late 2007, he was in Washington to scout locations for his film Pinkville about the My Lai massacre. He asked me to have dinner with him. He was just going to be here for one day. We'd been friends for over a decade before that and collaborated on a project that never got made. So we were having dinner, and over dinner he said, we're talking about history and politics as we always do, and Oliver says, Peter, let's do it. Let's do a documentary. It'll be one shot, documentary, we can knock it off. And the initial conception was going to go back to 1944, and when Harry Truman replaced Henry Wallace as vice president, and that is the major turning point in history. One time when Oliver was a guest in my class, the students asked him, said, Oliver, what do you consider the major turning point in history? And first he said, well, maybe Waterloo. They said, no, it had to be when Henry Wallace was kicked off the ticket as vice president in 1944. The first time Oliver and I had ever had dinner together back in 1996, I told him the story about how that happened and how that changed history. Because had Wallace been on the ticket and he was vice president from 41 to 45, had he remained on the ticket in 44 instead of Truman, then I argued that there would have been no atomic bombing in 1945 and possibly no Cold War. So Oliver understood that as a very exciting moment, and we go into a lot more detail. Actually, had Claude Pepper gotten 5 more feet to the microphone the opening night of the Democratic Convention in July 1944, then Wallace would have been back on the ticket, and 5 more feet would have changed all of history, or much of history, dramatically, fundamentally, in an exciting and positive way. However, they got Truman back. Truman on bosses pulled this off. Edwin Pauley, the Democratic Party treasurer, called it Pauley's coup, and they got Truman on the ticket, not because Truman was in any way qualified, but because Truman was pliable, obsequious, willing to go along with what he was being told. He was part of the Pendergast machine, and not somebody who was qualified at all as president, and made a lot of very, very disappointing decisions. So I told Oliver that story. He said, Peter, it's a fucking brilliant story. Let's do it. Let's make a movie. And he went back to LA, and he called me the next day, and I ended up writing the screenplay. We never got that one made. Maybe I'm not a great screenwriter. However, it led to this collaboration for Untold History. So when I went to see Oliver 2 weeks later in New York, our idea for a 1-hour documentary about the bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the origins of the Cold War, had now turned in Oliver's mind into a 10-part, 10-hour documentary film series. We ended up writing 12 episodes, 12 hours, that showed on Showtime, and is now showing all over the world. But about halfway through the process of writing that, we decided that we needed to write a book, because what you could say in 12 hours compared to what we wanted to say was only a small fraction. So we ended up writing an 800-page book to go along with it.
800
so that's
pages?
How this book came. Yeah, the original book is 800 pages. And we actually, in order to get it down to 800 pages, I had to cut out 150 pages. It was actually much longer. But they wanted a book. For some reason, they wanted a book that people could lift. As a historian, that wasn't so important to me.
You were looking for the fitness of America, right?
Right.
A little exercise while they're reading. That's a fantastic story. So the Untold History of the United States, does it begin with Truman then?
No. We start really in the late 19th century. It starts in some ways with the Depression of 1893 and the decision at that point to build an overseas empire, the Spanish-American War, the Filipino insurrection. That's very important because that was the first time that the United States really came down against a popular insurrection, against a popular government, popular movement. The United States changes our repression of Aguinaldo and the Filipinos in 1899 through 1902 was very bloody, very violent. It contradicted the will of the Filipino people. And the United States from that point on becomes a leading counter-revolutionary force. Before that, we had a revolutionary tradition. We supported revolutionary movements around the world. We had a fairly progressive foreign policy in many cases. But after that, we're going to pretty consistently be the main foe of any kind of revolutionary change or dramatic reform globally.
And that actually leads us to our next topic here. But before we get to the topic of American intervention, my last question would be, this is a show about psychology.
Yeah.
So our beliefs, our attitudes shape our perception of how we view the world, which in turn can change our decisions and whatnot. What was your purpose for the book? You obviously are trying to share something with people, open their eyes to something, and that can shift people one way or another.
Yes.
What was your purpose for it?
Now, our approach was not so much from a psychological standpoint, it was from a historical standpoint. We're working on the assumption that everybody is his or her own historian. Everybody's got a view of history. Sometimes it's more articulate and self-conscious than others, but everybody's got some view of history. And the way people act in the present is going to be based in part on that view of history. For example, if people assume that the current situation that we face now is the only way things could have turned out, then they're not going to be able to think in very dramatically different terms. If they see American history as an inevitable progression toward a Whiggish view of history, that somehow one thing led to another and turned out this way, and this was the best of all possible worlds, then they can't think. One of the things I bemoan is the fact that Americans have very much lost their ability to think in any utopian way. I think back to it in my youth in the 1960s. We were always dreaming of an alternative and a better and a fundamentally different world. I see very little of that in my students now. I see my students in some ways much more cynical about human nature, much more cynical about the possibility of dramatic change. They all are involved in voluntarism and reform and trying to smooth things out around the edges. I see very little of the kind of thinking that asks fundamental, deep questions about asking about the root of things. How do things turn out this way? Why do we have a world in which the richest 85 people have more wealth than the poorest 3.5 billion in the latest Oxfam report? You know, the fundamental questions about wealth and poverty and war and peace, they're not asking those big questions. They're asking, well, how can I help out in a soup kitchen? How can we deal with certain issues of racial injustice? But they're more reforming around the edges. What Oliver and I are trying to do with this is get them to ask deeper questions about the fundamental issues and the fundamental causes and why the world turned out this way. And if it had to turn out that way, it was why we began with Henry Wallace's story. Very few Americans even know who Henry Wallace is anymore. My students, even history students, don't know that Henry Wallace was vice president during that time, that Henry Wallace was charismatic in many ways, but certainly a brilliant, profound thinker who saw the world in very, very different terms. Wallace had an ability that few politicians have, and that's to see the world through the eyes of our adversaries. So he could see the way the world looked to the Soviets during World War II and the immediate aftermath. He could understand Soviet policy. Look now, even we're going to talk maybe about Ukraine. The inability of the United States to understand how what's going on in Ukraine looks through not only Putin's eyes, but the eyes of the Russian people. Why is Putin's popularity rating between 80 and 90%? Why does Angela Merkel say that Putin is in a parallel universe, that he's being irrational? You know, but it's that inability to see the world through other people's eyes. And what Oliver and I are trying to do with this book and our documentary series is open up those kinds of perspectives. See how close we've come over and over again to a different world and why other worlds are possible and we think could have been much better. So we're trying. The reason we did this is because back in 2008, Oliver, when we get asked this question at our public events, Oliver says, well, it was late 2007 And he thinks that Bush had totally screwed up the world. And he wanted to figure out and understand whether or not Bush was an aberration or Bush was a logical culmination of what had gone before. So in his mind, we wanted to plunge back in. And he likes to say that I gave him a 5-year, now 7-year tutorial on American history. And this was his education as a historian. And it's true. I mean, we read enormous amounts, and we discussed, we argued, we debated, we figured out how to shape these things, how to present them. So he's been immersed in U.S. history for the past 7 years.
I think it's a great cause. Great cause. Thank you for doing it. We're getting ready to go into American interventionism, but you reminded me of a quote from an author, French author, Marcel Proust, where he says, you don't need to discover new things. You don't need to go to exotic lands. All you need is a new set of eyes. And it kind of reminded me of that. But enough of my poetry for now. We're heading over to American interventionism.
Hi, welcome to Adelante. This is Adelante Recovery, and my name is Yvette Kuglin, and I'm part of the staff.
Adelante Recovery Center has helped people in dual diagnosis for 5 years. We accept most PPO insurances and provide luxury accommodations and 24-hour support. To speak with an admissions counselor, call 1-888-242-4450.
A lot of time we don't even know what's wrong with us, and sometimes we need to get away to figure that out. So if you want to go for a little retreat out in Corona del Mar, which is a confidential location, we're here to help. So we're only a phone call away. Thank you.
What's the deal with American interventionism? Are we overreaching ourselves in some of these situations like the Middle East and Ukraine?
Well, it's actually in some ways more complicated. It's not just that we're overreaching now, it's that our past overreach has created the conditions that we now say it's essential that we go in there and clean up the mess that we ourselves created. So this goes way back. Woodrow Wilson is an interesting case study because Wilsonian idealism, a certain kind of American idealism, it was Wilson after Versailles who said, now the world will see America as the savior of the world. And that idea, concept is deeply rooted in the American psyche. It goes back to John Winthrop's sermon aboard the Arbella in Massachusetts Bay in 1630, when he says, we're about to embark in Massachusetts Bay Colony, and he says, we shall be as a city upon the hill. The eyes of the world will be upon us. We're going to set the example for mankind. That's been deeply ingrained in American thinking since the 1630s, since we first came over, that we're God's gift to humanity. It's what we refer to as American exceptionalism. And one of the issues that Oliver and I are confronting throughout this is this question of American exceptionalism. But in the same sense that Wilson said we need the League of Nations so that we can clean up all the Treaty of Versailles, we're always wanting to intervene to clean up the mess that we created from our last intervention. That's why we trace it back to the origins of the Cold War. That's why we trace it back to 1898, why we trace it back to the nuclear age, because the United States, and the bomb was really the starting point. In fact, we were going to make our bomb episode, 1945, our first episode. We ended up not doing that, but that was conceptually, in the way we were approaching it, the start. Because once the United States had the bomb, once the United States could threaten mankind with annihilation, once the United States had that ability to destroy any other country, then we interpret ourselves as having the moral rectitude to do that, to go along with the military superiority. And that really infuses our policies and informs our policies throughout the Cold War. So our early interventions in the immediate post-war period, we can get back to the origins of the Cold War and why that should have and could have been avoided. But it's really in the 1950s that the United States begins very aggressively to overthrow governments, overthrow popular governments. So if we want to talk about the situation with Iran now, for example, we can trace that back to 1946, when Truman says he threatened the Soviets with nuclear warfare if they didn't get out of Iran in 1946. Or we can trace it, probably more people we want to trace that back to 1953, when we overthrow the Mossadegh government. Mossadegh was enormously popular. He had just been Time's Man of the Year on the cover of Time magazine, the first Iranian leader, the first Iranian to get a PhD at a Western university. And it was a very important figure and a rallying figure for much of the Islamic world at the time. Well, we overthrew him. Why did we overthrow him? Because he was anti-British colonialism, and the British controlled the Iranian oil. They were giving them a very bad deal on the oil. Iranian nationalism wanted the Iranian, and so they nationalized the oil. The British weren't happy with what they were willing to pay them for the oil that they had nationalized, and then they get the United States to intervene on their behalf. Truman had actually hesitated to do so. Once Eisenhower and Dulles got in there, they were much quicker to want to intervene militarily. They overthrow the Mossadegh government, replace Mossadegh with the Shah, who's a very, very repressive and unpopular. So they overthrow this enormously popular leader and replace him with this repressive leader, with the Savak, the police, secret police and intelligence agencies, create this repressive regime. But Iran is willing to support U.S. interests in the Middle East. Then when they get overthrown in 1979 by Khomeini, then there's this hostility toward the United States, which of course has never ended. But we trace all of these things back to their origins. So you could say at a certain point, well, yeah, you don't want Iran to get the bomb, and nobody wants Iran to get the bomb. I certainly don't. I don't want to see nuclear proliferation. I don't want to see nuclear anarchy in the Middle East. But we have to understand the roots of these policies and why so many people around the world resent the United States, why people in many parts of the world hate the United States. But it's that policy of U.S. interventionism. Some of them are on a much bigger scale than others. We overthrow the government of Iran in 1953. We overthrow the government of Guatemala in 1954. We start getting involved in supporting very repressive governments around the world. We're still doing that in the Middle East. We did that for decades. We're willing to support these tyrants if they will enhance U.S. economic and geopolitical interests in those regions. The war of my youth was the Vietnam War. And Vietnam, again, is something that the historical roots are just not understood. Or one of the very disturbing things for me, in my mind, Vietnam is the epitome. If we're going to say what epitomizes the worst crimes against humanity that the United States has committed, it would be Vietnam. However, the latest Gallup poll shows that 51% of 18 to 29-year-olds say that the Vietnam War was not a mistake, that the Vietnam War was worth fighting. Really? 51% of 18 to 29-year-olds. This is people older who have some memory of this are overwhelmingly still opposed to Vietnam and still see it as a travesty.
Why do you think that is?
I think, first of all, Americans have very little historical knowledge. In fact, when the National Report Card issued in 2011 showed that American high school seniors, the area in which they came in last in terms of their knowledge was not math, was not science, was not languages, it was U.S. history. 12% of high school seniors were judged to be proficient in U.S. history. Not outstanding, proficient, minimally proficient. And I don't even know how they rated proficient, because only 2% could answer the question of what issue the Brown versus Board of Education was trying to address, even though it was obvious in the way the question was worded. Only 2%. So 12% proficiency in U.S. history is probably high. So they don't know much about Vietnam. And the problem we run into always is that people know very little U.S. history, and much of what they know is wrong. So they know very little about Vietnam, and there's been this attempt to whitewash, to sanitize Vietnam ever since the end of the war. Ford started saying, well, we shouldn't look backwards, we have to look forward. You've got Reagan saying it was a noble cause. We fought, we shouldn't think badly about ourselves for Vietnam, it was a noble cause. You've got much of the same. It was Obama who announced a 13-year commemoration of the Vietnam War. And again, the soldiers were noble. Well, how can the soldiers be noble if the cause was ignoble? Yes, individuals were not wanting to do terrible things and crimes, but they were put in a position there. And so If we're going to honor American soldiers for what happened in Vietnam, I'm not saying we should condemn them for it, but to say this is somehow a noble, that they were fighting in a noble cause, then you can say that about any people. You can say that about the Japanese who fought in World War II in China. You can say that about anybody. So I think that kind of relooking at Vietnam from the standpoint of the way the Obama administration, the Pentagon, are planning to do it, purpose. That's why, as Oliver and I say in the introduction to our book, said there are libraries filled with books about what the United States has done right. There are movies about what the United States has done right. What we're trying to do is cast the light on what the United States has done wrong, because we want the United States to be better, and we think the United States could be better. We want to learn from the mistakes of the past. So that's what our focus has been. Vietnam, let's go back to Vietnam for a minute. I asked my students how many Americans died in the war. Some of them know the 58,000 figure. Almost none. Then I asked them, a lot of them don't know that, but they sometimes reason and figure in that range. I asked them how many Vietnamese died in the war, and I usually get the answer of around 100,000 Vietnamese died in the war. When Robert McNamara came into my class, he said that he accepts that 3.8 million Vietnamese died in the war. And but the fact that Americans have no idea. I used to be able to ask them how many Jews died in the Holocaust, and all hands would go up. They would all know 6 million. Nowadays, I can't even count on that. So they don't even know that. But it's instructive to me that Americans can know atrocities committed by other countries, but they have no idea about the atrocities committed by their own government. Vietnam Memorial Wall. Okay, it has the names of 58,270 Americans who died. The message of that wall is that the tragedy of Vietnam is that 58,270 Americans died. The Vietnam Memorial Wall is 492 feet long. If that wall included the names of all the Vietnamese, the Cambodians, the Laotians, the Americans, everybody who died in that war, it would be over 8 miles long. That to me would be a war memorial. That would send the message that we might learn something from. Of course, it was tragic that 58,270 Americans died. But the real tragedy was that the United States went in there and is responsible for over 4 million, close to 5 million deaths. And we don't know that. We don't know those kinds of atrocities. So the history of American interventionism gets clouded by this idea that the United States is essentially good. We make mistakes, but our heart is in the right place. Other countries make mistakes because they're evil, but the United States is different. And that's this idea of American exceptionalism, that the United States is different from all other countries because even if we make mistakes, we're altruistic. We're motivated by wanting to spread freedom, wanting to spread democracy. We're different than all other countries. All other countries are motivated by greed, geopolitics, desire for power, desire for land. The United States is somehow different. But as long as we maintain that myth, we're going to go down the same road, make the same mistakes, going to intervene in the Iraqs, going to intervene, invade the Afghanistans, invade the Libyas, and not learn anything from our mistakes.
Well, I got a couple of questions if you don't mind.
Sure.
So it's really interesting because it has serious implications. I'm trying to get this out of my head here. Because diplomacy is going to be essential. Learning about this is essential for diplomacy. I'm assuming a lot of the diplomats, people who do secretaries of state, people who do negotiations with other countries should be aware of this. And now that our students, like you said, your students are coming out to 25, 30-year-olds, some of these are going to head into political careers. It's very important for them to know what really happened in history to be able to understand and how to deal with other countries. Am I correct?
You're absolutely correct, yes.
Yeah,
it's essential that all citizens know this in order to hold our governments accountable. To be a citizen carries certain responsibilities. I'm not saying we're a democracy, but we still can vote. We still can speak out. We can still say these things. In many ways, this country, of course, is not a democracy. It's totally far from a democracy, but it's even far from a republic in a meaningful sense. And certainly far from the 19th century Republican traditions that founded the modern era. But yeah, it's essential that people study their history, know their history, not only the good parts, even more important that they know the bad parts.
And Dr. Kuznick, there are going to be some viewers who are going to say, wait a minute, American exceptionalism, here you go, you're trying to degrade America. But there's a way of being proud of your country
Yes.
and not
We've
having to.
loving your country, yes.
So how would you present that to these people who are going to probably be on the opposite side of your view, or just might have a misunderstanding of your view?
Well, I'm not going to convince everybody. There are some people who can't hear what I'm trying to say. That's why it's always interesting when Oliver and I do our events together, because I was an anti-war activist during Vietnam. He volunteered to serve. Oliver dropped out of Yale and volunteered for combat duty in Vietnam, was highly decorated, wounded twice. I mean, how many people do we know who dropped out of Yale in the mid-1960s to volunteer for combat in Vietnam? Oliver was a true believer, a total patriot, grew up in a very conservative Republican family. I grew up in a very liberal Democratic family, so I had a very different kind of experience. I was active in the civil rights movement, active in the anti-war movement, very active in anti-nuclear movements and other things. So Oliver and I, the interesting thing is the way we converged, given how different our starting points were. So I think that to love one's country, one has to want to make one's country better. One has to want to make one's country live up to its ideals, to be its best self. And I'm firmly convinced that the United States could be a much more positive force in the world, and that our own citizens suffer also because of certain wrong-headed policies that we adopt. The fact that even in the United States, the richest 1% have more wealth than the poorest 90%. The fact that in the United States, the 6 Walmart heirs have more wealth than the poorest 30% of Americans. There are things about the distribution of wealth in this country that I find obscene, as I do find it obscene on a global scale.
Dr. Kuznick, I know we're going to have a lot of people who are going to agree with you, and they're going to want to know more about you. Where do we go to find out more about you?
Well, I've got my website at American University here in Washington, D.C. If any of your viewers are interested, what I would like to convince them to try to join us on, is my study abroad class in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There's nothing quite like this in the world. Every summer from July 30th to August 11th, we bring students from American University and other universities. And actually last summer we brought 3 senior citizens and 3 high school students also. So it's not just for university students. We've got non-credit options also. And we go to Kyoto, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, spend the last night in Tokyo. We travel with Japanese students and professors from Ritsumeikan University and Asia Pacific University, and we bring students from China and Korea and the Philippines and Vietnam and other places. It's a very, very exciting experience. We spend time with one of the leading hibakusha, the atomic bomb survivors, travels with us the entire time. And we spend a lot of time with atomic bomb survivors. We go to all the commemorative events, all the museums, meet with Japanese experts, American experts. We have several historians on board with us this summer, including my student Vincent Ntonde, whose book came out 2 weeks ago, African Americans Against the Bomb. Very proud of that, Stanford University Press. So yeah, you can easily Google me at American University is the easiest way. And if anybody's interested, I'd be happy to give them lots more information about our
fabulous trip
in Japan.
Fabulous trip, fabulous idea. Thank you very much again, Dr. Kuznick. Here's the book, The Untold History of the United States. You got to read it. Learn about the history the right way. Thank you again, Dr. Kuznick. We appreciate you being on the circle. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Remember, our motto is simple. Wherever there's psychology involved, even in the untold side, we're there. See you next time, everyone.